Bueno, seguimos con la doctora Kazak. La verdad que les tengo que decir que para mí es una gran alegría que ella, tan generosa y con mucha humildad, aceptó la invitación y le pedimos un montón de cuestiones técnicas y que ella siempre accedió y ha estado disponible para nosotros. La doctora Kazak es una investigadora excelente, reconocida en todo el mundo. Yo voy a decir solo algunas cosas de ella, ustedes ponen su nombre y van a tener un currículum extensísimo. Ella es licenciada en Pensilvania y Delaware y diplomática de la Junta Estadounidense de Psicología Profesional. Es directora empresarial del Nemours Alfred DuPont Hospital for Children in Wilmington, co-directora del Centro de Estrés Traumático Pediátrico. Es profesora de la Universidad Thomas Jefferson de Filadelfia, de la Universidad de Pensilvania y de la Universidad de Delaware, como tiene el cartel detrás. Además, es la actual editora en jefa de la American Psychologist. Esto es algo chiquito porque si no le tomamos más tiempo de la charla que Anne nos va a dar, pero no quería dejar de comentar que la verdad que la humildad y la generosidad que se dispuso a mandarnos la presentación con tiempo para que pudiéramos hacer un subtitulado para que todos pudieran seguir la charla, ha sido, y le agradezco en nombre de toda la fundación por su generosa participación, y ponemos el video.
Hello, my name is Ann Kazak. It's a great pleasure and an honor to have been invited to participate in your conference this summer. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. This is the best we can do at this particular point, but I would like very much to have a chance to talk with you and to get to know you and to learn about all of your wonderful programs, some of which I've seen on the website. So I am going to take a second here and share my screen so that we can begin. I'm going to talk with you today about psychosocial assessment in families of children with cancer, and specifically about the Psychosocial Assessment Tool, or the PAT, as we call it. Before I begin, I want to thank the many, many people who've worked on this project for more than 25 years, and the many different foundations that have funded this work over the years. And I have no disclosures to discuss in terms of this presentation. What I'd like to do today are three things. First, I'd like to talk generally about the importance of a systematic family psychosocial risk screening as it can enhance clinical care and support health equity in pediatrics, meaning making sure that we're screening all families and not missing anyone in our efforts to deliver good care. Specifically, I'd like to introduce the Psychosocial Assessment Tool, or the PAT, which is an evidence-based screener of family psychosocial risk. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that's ongoing right now, where we are testing some implementation strategies to get universal family risk screening in English and Spanish across 18 pediatric cancer programs around the United States. So why is family psychosocial risk screening important? Well, the research literature is very strong and provides consistent evidence for multiple aspects of psychosocial risk for families of children with cancer and of other conditions for that matter. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk with you about the standards, the National Pediatric Psychosocial Standards of Care that we've developed. And not to jump to the point here, but the first standard is about screening. And that is that youth with cancer and their families should routinely receive systematic assessments of their psychosocial health needs. And that is the standard that this work is most directly related to. We are pleased that we've had many key professional societies recommend screening and endorse the standards. And recently, psychosocial screening has been termed the eighth vital sign, which I think is a very important move towards integrating what we do into medical evaluation and care. Clinically, we think that screening can change the course of psychosocial and even medical outcomes. It's preventative, it's helping families early on, it provides the right intervention at the right time, and it can promote health equity because we assure that all families will get care matched to their needs if we're able to screen everybody. You may be familiar with some variant of this diagram and with the concept of social ecology. Social ecology basically posits that children live in families, and those families exist within broader social contexts. Pediatric healthcare is inherently family-oriented. It would be hard to imagine providing care without involving the family at some level. And we know that children may not be able to even recognize, understand, or communicate their distress, so understanding children in the context of the family is important. We also know that there are multiple levels of our systems, of our society, of our cultures, and our neighborhoods that impact children with cancer and other children as well. And part of what we try to do in psychosocial risk screening is look at different types of risks across that social ecology. So what I'm doing here, these are little fires to show that these are hotspots. These are areas of risk, for example, in a child. Here's one by the school, over by the parents, maybe social class, challenges that a particular family might have. And if we can identify those, then we can think about how to intervene to address them. As I talk about all this, I do want to emphasize that families are very resilient, even families with cancer. We know this over and over again, and I'll show you some additional data on that as we go. But the majority of families are resilient, are coping, and will be able to cope successfully. That doesn't mean, by the way, that they're not suffering. They certainly can be suffering and having a hard time, but we know that they will be, in most cases, able to sustain and to get through this. But our goal with screening is to identify those who are at greatest risk as early as possible to prevent the escalation of problems and to provide evidence-based treatments to promote adjustment and positive outcomes. So to build, if you will, on that resilience to identify areas of strength. So why is screening important? A little bit more about this. Systematic screening for all families as a standard of care. What does that accomplish? Well, it can change the course of outcomes. Already mentioned that by providing early and treatments matched to the families and child and families' need. It can be part of a good crisis management program. Getting in there and doing early intervention can reduce or prevent later problems. Ideally, it provides the right intervention at the right time. And as I've indicated, it promotes health equity, assuring that everybody gets care matched to their needs. But there's also benefits to healthcare providers, and I think this is important to consider as well. First of all, it's consistent with the psychosocial standards, and we do want sites all around the world to think about the standards as something that they can achieve or aspire to, or take and deliver in ways that make sense in their systems. Screening has the potential to make healthcare providers' jobs easier through that early identification of risk and prevention of problems. In other words, it's always easier to prevent the problem, to intervene early, than to let it develop and potentially blow up into a bigger problem. So it can increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of your practice to be able to know at the outset what the family might need. It's also an early step in building a relationship with families, and that's really what I think we're often doing, and we're often very good at, because people are warm and engaging and we want to help. But the screening provides a little bit of structure for that in terms of saying, we want to understand how we can help you and what areas of concern you may have that we can help. This is an important model for the PAT and for our screening. We call it the triple PHM. It's based on a public health model, and the concept is that that families fall into three different tiers. At the bottom tier, we call universal. And these are the families that I mentioned before, very competent, resilient families they will benefit from things like psychoeducational, family-centered support, and certainly somebody screening and watching and expressing concern for them. They're distressed but resilient. This is actually the majority of families. The middle area there in the green are targeted families. And these are families where there's some acute or elevated distress, some other risk factors present. So I think, for example, of a child who has had hyperactivity or behavior concerns before they were diagnosed with cancer. I think about a family where there are known family problems, and cancer becomes one more thing on top of that. Now, the nice thing about this targeted level is that there are really things that we can jump in and do to help and to deliver evidence-based care. At the top of the pyramid in the orange are families that we call clinical or treatment families. And these are the families that are the easiest to recognize. They are the most upset. They may be have escalating, they may have persistent distress. And in these cases, what we typically recommend is that you consult a behavioral health specialist, a psychologist or social worker, perhaps psychiatrist even, and intensify care to them and really tease apart the extent to which these problems may be impacting the delivery of medical care. So here's some interventions that we recommend based on the levels of triple PHM. At the universal level, as I mentioned, psychosocial education, pastoral counseling, case management, medical play, contact with schools, and general supportive counseling. These are things that I think are not too difficult to deliver. They do require people to do it. They do require the development of programs, but they're very helpful to support families. At the targeted level, we have things like more intensive counseling, medical play that's specific to a problem, say a child who gets very anxious about procedures. We work on adaptation to illness, to adherence to treatment, to problems with pain, or sometimes family problems, custody or divorce situations in the family, for example. And at the clinical level, where we have severe escalating problems, we're thinking more about crisis intervention, the potential for the use of medication. We call a buddy system, or really closely staffing families because there's some concern about risks or safety, and sometimes involvement of other systems like the legal or child welfare system. So what is the PAT? PAT is a brief parent report screener of psychosocial risk. We recommend that it be completed online. We have different versions of it, but we do encourage the use of the online versions at this point. It's based, as I mentioned, on social ecology and on the triple PHM. It originated in pediatric cancer, and that is where it is most frequently used, but we do have several adaptations that we have done and that others have done for other diseases, and I'd be happy to provide more information about any of those. The PAT is all literacy. It's in English and it's in Spanish in fourth grade reading level, and it takes about 10 minutes to complete. PAT's been very well received around the world. It's used now at about 120 sites in the United States and 50 sites internationally. However, we still need to learn more about how the PAT is actually used, how it's integrated into practice, and to look at what sort of strategies might help increase the uptake of the PAT in practice. As I mentioned, there's some adaptations of the PAT for other illnesses, and they are noted on this slide. We've also translated and worked with people around the world to have different versions of the PAT in other languages and with cultural adaptations for the PAT. I'm sure this is probably somewhat difficult to see, but I wanted to show it to you because it is the a page on the PAT in Spanish. This is based on the paper and pencil PAT. So it looks, actually looks more interesting than it looks online because, it's prettier on paper, although as I mentioned, we really don't encourage people to use the paper version at this point. So let me spend a few minutes talking about some of the psychometrics of the PAT. What you can see here is that we recently validated the current version of the PAT in both English and Spanish. These are factor loadings for the 7 subscales of the PAT, which I haven't reviewed with you yet, but you can see them there: family structure, social support, child problems, sibling problems, family problems, stress reactions, and family beliefs, as well as a total score. And what you can see there is that the PAT shows internal validation. It has a relatively high reliability coefficients on most of the subscales. In particular, if you look at the total score of 0.81 in English and 0.76 in Spanish. We also looked at external validation. That is, does the PAT and its subscales relate to other measures of the same constructs? And I don't have time to go into all of this in detail, but it is in these 2 papers that are listed below. And basically what you can see is all associations were statistically significant, and they were in the expected direction. So for example, just to use the example of child problems or sibling problems, we used the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire to validate those scales. Now, people sometimes ask, what happens over time if you give the PAT more than once? And that's a very good question. It's a very important question. What we find is that there's pretty good consistency in PAT scores over time. And scores at diagnosis and in intervals of 4 to 6 months later tend to be related at about a 0.63 level, which is strong. Now, what happens with the levels? What we find is that about 2/3 of families actually stay at the same level. The good news is 32% decrease their risk, and a relatively small percentage increase their risk. And we see, not surprisingly, that families that are scoring in the universal level are more stable than those in the targeted or clinical levels. We saw similar results in another study, a larger study that we did, although we saw a more balanced perspective on those families who had less risk and those who had greater risk. So this slide shows on the right the subscales that I mentioned before. And what is on the left is kind of where we started when we were trying to develop the PAT and all of the things that we wanted to look at. And we took those and we discussed them and we talked in great detail about how to measure them, and we condensed them into the 7 subscales. So how do you score the PAT? The items are scored positive. That's based on research literature and clinical expertise. And we get a score for each of the subscales, and then we sum that up to a total score. And what happens is those total scores are mapped onto the triple P-HM. So the higher your score, the higher your risk. And if your score is above a 2, for example, you're in the highest level, the clinical level. In addition to the scores, we also provide clinically relevant items that we consider red flags. And when a site is using the PAT, they can actually also decide what they think are particularly important items that they want to respond to more urgently. So again, if a family scores at the universal level, we think of them as having supportive resources, relatively low psychosocial risk, and we provide interventions that are focused on education about psychosocial impact, positive coping strategies, and we support their seeking help among family members and friends in their community. When a family is in a targeted level, we say, well, they have some supportive resources, but they also have some risk factors that might impact their adjustment to their child's illness or to the adherence to treatment. And here we recommend more focused interventions to address whatever areas are elevated on the PAT, family problems, parent or child stress reactions, or beliefs that might negatively impact their adjustment to it or adherence. And at the clinical level, we say, okay, in this case, we have fewer supportive resources and more areas of difficulty, and we're more concerned about the impact of this on adjustment and on the treatment. And here, clinical interventions are recommended, including a mental health evaluation, more intensive psychosocial care, etc. Now, in this slide, you see the differences in the distribution for the families that completed the PAT in English and in Spanish in the United States. And what you see here is kind of interesting. On the left, you see that 62.5% of families that completed the PAT in English are in the universal level. That is very typical of what we see across a lot of samples. That's why I say families are resilient. Most families are going to cope and adjust. 27% are in targeted, let's get some evidence-based interventions to them, and 11% are clinical. Now, what we see with the Spanish-speaking sample, the families that did the PAT in Spanish, is different. We see here fewer families in the universal, about 35%, almost half, 47% in the middle, and a slightly elevated level in the highest level. So we find this very interesting, and certainly in the United States, we have concerns. We want to provide care and help to families that are more disadvantaged and maybe more disengaged and less educated from the healthcare system. So this was of significant concern and leads us to believe that we are doing the right thing in terms of thinking about how can we best screen everybody so that we can provide the care that they need. I wanted also to show you a sample of the form that we send to the healthcare team when a family has completed the PAT. Basically, we say, okay, the family has completed the PAT, and we give their overall risk level relative to the triple PHM. Low, we call it low, moderate, and high for purposes of communicating with the team. We also give feedback to families, and it's a similar form, but they just get one form. And this form, for example, is in the middle there, we say your family has some strengths and resources. You have some needs for help and support. And so you read between the lines there, that's a family that's in a targeted level. And then we actually indicate to the family, based on what you told us on the PAT, these are the areas that we think make sense to work on and to address. So it becomes kind of a contract and an agreement for what we're going to work on together. So I want to briefly now in the final section of this presentation to talk to you a little bit about the implementation work that we're doing. We began by saying, what are the barriers and what are the facilitators to using a screener? Because it's not as simple as it seems. You know, if it were, people would use it and we'd be very happy, but it's hard to get people to change their practice and to use it. So we backed up a little bit and said, let's understand how people feel about screening. Who should be screened? What would you need in order to use a screener like the PAT? Who would be in favor of screening? Who might object to it, etc. Based on a qualitative study that we conducted and we analyzed the data, we found that people basically said screening is important because it facilitates clinical care. And how does it do that? Well, it optimizes psychosocial care. It makes it easier to deliver that. Then they talked about how to implement. They had ideas about that, ways of providing early assessment and communicating results. They talked about engaging families in the process. And I think that's been very important in general. We also learned about utilizing clinical pathways, which is to say, the PAT is just a screener. It's just the first step. And you go from there to examine in greater detail what's going on in the family and to determine the treatment based on gathering more information about the problems and the strengths. So this is a study now that we are conducting. It's an implementation science study. We have the validated clinically relevant screener. We have the PAT. We have evidence that screening is not systematic at this point. It's not universal, and it's not always evidence-based. We conducted a qualitative study. We got some information about barriers and facilitators. We've also completed a pilot study of the PAT, which I didn't discuss in this, but a pilot trial of implementation, which went quite well. And now we're testing 2 different strategies in a cluster randomized trial around the United States. The first strategy is a training seminar. And some people will say, well, training is not enough. Training is necessary, but perhaps not enough. And we say, well, that could be, but on the other hand, for busy clinical practices and busy clinicians, training is something that is feasible. So we have a professionally prepared webinar, all about the PAT and all about the study and what they need to do and what we're looking at. The second strategy, and we randomize sites. The second strategy is the training plus what we call implementation enhanced resources. And that is the identification of a champion, someone who is advocating for the study, who is problem solving, who is kind of a cheerleader and a coach in the process, and also monthly consultation calls where we talk about people's experiences with implementing the PAT, problem solve as a group, sort of a learning collaborative model. So these are things that I basically already said. I got a little bit ahead of myself before, but we have a professionally prepared webinar. We talk about, why screen, what's the evidence for the PAT. We go into a lot of the things that I've talked about in this presentation, but in somewhat more detail. We also include clips of some families and providers talking about screening and how screening has been important to them. And I think that's quite compelling as well. We have people do an implementation plan at the end of the training webinar where they specify exactly who will do the screening, who will be screened, how are you going to use the PAT in clinical care. Is there anything about your setting that we should think about or anticipate as we roll out the PAT? We talk about the responsibilities for the champion for people in that condition. And of course, we talk about the details of the research study. So what is a champion? I mentioned this already. It's an advocate. It's someone who's passionate about screening and excited to help and problem solve. Doesn't actually screen themselves, but is there to be a resource to those that are doing the screening. The consultation calls are video calls, an opportunity to obtain ongoing consultation on implementation, and it creates a learning collaborative environment. People share what they're doing and how they're doing it, and you see people get ideas and learn from others in that process. So in conclusion, I think it's very important to use an evidence-based screener to identify the needs of families early in treatment and match that need to care. One of the most pressing concerns is that care is often not delivered in an equitable manner and assuring that all children and families have access to early assessment and intervention. So we're hoping that by learning more about how to implement evidence-based risk screening, we can do that so that everybody gets screened. And there's probably many different ways to test this, and these are kind of ideas that I would like to talk with you about in terms of, in your experiences, in your settings, what would it take to implement psychosocial risk screening and in the spirit of meeting the standards of the psychosocial care. So this concludes my formal presentation, if you will. I understand that we will have an opportunity to have some questions and answers and get to know each other a little bit better, and I very much look forward to that. Thank you.
Bueno, excelente, la verdad que un gusto escuchar la presentación de Anne. Tenemos algunas preguntas, los invitamos a que puedan escribir alguna pregunta más para Anne en el espacio de preguntas, pero mientras tanto ya tenemos unas que Sofía le va a hacer a Anne.
Okay, hi Anne, that was an excellent presentation, as I was saying just that. And the audience wanted to know if there is a way to access the PAT in a web page, or should they enter to a specific place to get access to that kind of screening?
Yes, thank you. I mean, let me say again how happy I am and honored to be part of your conference today.
Anne dice que agradece muchísimo la posibilidad de ser parte de esta conferencia el día de hoy, que es un honor para ella.
We would be delighted to make the Spanish version of the PAT available to you. It is a web-based form. I don't know the best way to do that. What I could do is provide the name and email of the person who manages that for me. That's probably the best thing. And anyone who would like could also send me an email directly, and I'd be happy to make sure it gets to the right person.
Dice Anne que estaría feliz de poder hacer accesible para todos la versión en español del PAT, que para eso puede, por un lado, brindar un mail y un correo, digamos un mail y una dirección a la cual se podrían conectar, probablemente después por medio de Teresa y la Fundación. Pueden brindar el correo de Anne también, si no, y ella les proveerá el acceso. La otra...
Sí. No, sería muy lindo que el equipo de psicología de la Fundación pudiera colaborar en la traducción para hacerlo llegar a los equipos de habla hispana, ¿no?
Sí, ellos tienen una versión.
Eso sí, ella.
Okay, and whatever you need in terms of translation and Spanish population would be an honor for the psychologist team of the foundation to be able to help regarding that kind of stuff.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And another question that they had was regarding this difference that you found on the Spanish-speaking population and the English-speaking population. And they wanted to know a little more about what do you think the reason about this difference, or maybe what else did you find regarding this kind of difference between the families that spoke English and the ones that didn't?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, my sense is that it might be specific to the United States.
Esa es una buena pregunta. Lo que ella piensa, lo que ella siente, su intuición es que es algo muy específico de los Estados Unidos.
Because many of the Spanish-speaking families in our studies are more recent immigrants to the United States, and they tend to have fewer socioeconomic resources, more poverty, more difficulties succeeding. And we had, for example, a substantial number of Spanish-speaking families who actually had difficulty reading the PAT in Spanish. And it's written at what we consider a 4th grade reading level. So I think that the sample that we have in the United States is in large part about socioeconomic status.
Okay. Lo que explica Anne es que la población que accede en los Estados Unidos, la muestra que tienen de familias de habla hispana son familias que han emigrado hace, digamos, recientemente, entonces por esta razón hay un tema socioeconómico inherente a estas familias y que también tuvieron ciertas dificultades en poder leer el PAD incluso en español, y lo que ella explica es que es una lectura, digamos, a un nivel de un chico de 4º grado y aún así tuvieron dificultades, entonces que puede ser como una cuestión muy característica de la muestra analizada. Okay, they sent me another question. They say, Lucia Fuentes says that it is a pleasure to listen to Anne discuss about this PAD, and that she's interested in validating PAD for Guatemala and Central American region. Is that an option?
I want to make sure I understand the question. She'd like to translate it for Central America? Is that?
Yes, more of a validation, but yes, translated, and I think that that translation in the population.
Sorry, ¿le podés decir en español la pregunta de Lucía Fuentes?
Sí, perdón, que Lucía Fuentes dijo que es un placer para ella poder escuchar a a Ana hablando del PAD y que estaba interesada en poder validar el PAD para Guatemala y la región de América Central, si esto es una posibilidad.
So let me see if I'm not sure if I'm getting the answer right here or not. There are many dialects of Spanish, and even in the United States, even in California or Florida, or one state. And one of my Spanish-speaking coordinators said to me one time, he said, this is American Spanish. And I said, well, that's okay, because we're in America. So we would be glad to have people, we understand that it needs some additional work and refinement to fit into different cultural contexts. I'd be happy.
Dice Anne que incluso en Estados Unidos, cuando ellos estuvieron analizando la traducción, que hay muchísimos dialectos en español y maneras de hablar el español, y que cuando ella hizo la traducción, la persona que le ayudó a traducir le dijo, esto es español de Estados Unidos, y ella dijo, está bien porque estamos en Estados Unidos, pero que entiende que la manera de hablar el español tiene mucho que ver con lo cultural y que estaría encantada de poder colaborar en seguir adaptando, y que sabe que todavía tienen que seguir adaptando el PAD para distintas cuestiones culturales muy puntuales. Continue on. That's okay for that one?
Yeah. Okay.
And the other one is if the PAD is used only in the USA, or has it been validated in Spanish-speaking population in other countries? O sea, si solo se validó en poblaciones de habla hispana en Estados Unidos, o si ha sido usado o validado en algunos otros lugares de habla hispana.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, and I might have to look to answer that. It has been used in other countries. Whether or not it's been used in other Spanish-speaking countries, I'm not sure offhand, but we have had translations into several different countries. For example, it's used quite widely in the Netherlands, and has been translated into many different languages. But I would be glad to look up the answer to that, because I'm actually not sure offhand.
Okay.
There was at one time some psychologists that were working with Maru Barrera, who's at Sick Kids in Toronto, on using the PAD in Central America, and I'm not sure what happened with that initiative.
Ok, dice Anne entonces que esa pregunta la tiene que buscar en detalle porque no está tan segura de en qué países se utilizó y en qué países no. Sí sabe que fue utilizado en muchos países distintos, como por ejemplo tiene muchísimo uso en Holanda, y que hubo un grupo de psicólogas que estuvieron trabajando en Toronto con no entendí si una psicóloga exactamente, que se llama Maru Barrera, que trabaja con chicos enfermos, que tenía una iniciativa de validarlo y utilizarlo en población de Centroamérica, pero que no sabe exactamente cómo terminó esa iniciativa, así que estará encantada de poder buscarlo y volver a brindarle la información seguramente a la fundación, que podrá compartirlo con todas las personas de la audiencia. ¿Te parece, Teresa, hacemos la última? ¿O tenemos tiempo? ¿Sí? Ok. Bueno. And we will have the last question due to the time. We don't want to keep you out anymore. And from the other speakers, this person says that she was, or he was, struck by the fact that the adherence is a problem of the target population and not of the clinical population. Why in that group and not in the other?
I'm sorry, what was the problem?
The adherence to the treatment or to the screening. Adherence in terms of not being adherent to the treatment, not to continue with the.
I'm not sure what word you're saying. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Adherence.
Adherence. Okay. And would you say the question again, please?
Yes, sorry. That she was surprised that this was a problem of the target population and not of the clinical population. I think she was talking about the specific.
Well, it could be it certainly could be a problem at the clinical level. In fact, some of the worst, most non-adherent families might be at the clinical level, but we're in the model, we're interested in helping families where some adherence is maybe starting to be recognized as a problem. How are you going to get your child to take their medication? How are you going to come to understand why it's important, and how to cope with the side effects and things like that? So adherence could be a problem at many different levels. We put it in the middle, in part because we want to help people before it escalates to the clinical level.
Dice que en realidad, en primer lugar la pregunta en español era que estaban sorprendidos por el hecho de que la adherencia sea un problema en el estudio, en la parte de la targeted population, la población targeteada, no sé exactamente cómo lo definirían en español, y no de la población clínica. Y ella lo que menciona es que en realidad la adherencia es un problema de todos los grupos, pero lo que intentan hacer es como seleccionar y prestar atención en los primeros momentos que se presenta cierta pérdida de adherencia, como para poder ayudar antes de que sea un problema clínico y poder hacer foco sobre esto, en una primera instancia. No sé, Teresa, si hay alguna otra pregunta que yo no esté recibiendo, algo así como medio urgente, o quieren que finalicemos. Estás muteada, Teresa. No se escucha.
Perdón. Digo, como probablemente mañana va a estar con nosotros, van a surgir muchas más preguntas mañana y podemos continuar mañana, que se va a unir con la presentación, ¿no? Ambas presentations.
Dice, Teresa says that tomorrow maybe all the people that are in the audience will have some new questions about the path after investigating something and after having a day. So maybe tomorrow with the other presentation we will have another question regarding this presentation. So we want to thank you a lot for the presentation and see you tomorrow.
Okay. La verdad que un lujo y una alegría que compartas con todos nosotros.